kind of how I think. I'm very present. I don't daydream. I don't think about the past. Like, I am very in the moment, which frustrates my wife beyond all belief. Because she could not be more opposite. Everything is, she's thinking about the future or she's thinking about the past, but I'm here because this is all I have. And so when I'm here and I'm present, I'm thinking about these things because I'm thinking about how do I derive as much meaning out of this moment because I might not have another one.
Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys, the podcast of great conversations with men. I'm your host, Chris Foster, and we're going to explore how we wear this beautiful and confusing mantle of manhood in the 21st century. Look, I get it. In public life, a lot of men are knuckleheads. But in private life, we can be thoughtful and we can be reflective if we have the right conversation, if we feel comfortable talking about our story. And we all have a great story to tell. And we can all learn from those stories. We can learn about who we've been, who we are, and who we want to be. And that's why we're going to have this conversation, so we can learn from other men just like us. And in this episode, we're going to talk with my new friend, Zack. Zack had an upbringing of a deeply intense, evangelical, Southern Baptist Christian family. Homeschooled, taught himself to read when he was in first grade or 8 years old, and came into an interesting transition of faith later in life with one of the most profound experiences anyone can have. He is a person who's in the moment, thinks of faith in the moment, and thinks of love as a verb. Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys. As a caution to listeners, this episode does contain content and conversations about suicide. If you are thinking of suicide and have suicidal thoughts or suffering from depression in a severe way, please call 988. Again, please call the Suicide Hotline Prevention at 988. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, all right, Zack Van Nuss, welcome in.
Chris, thank you for having me. It's really good to be here.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I am Zack. I am 35. I currently live just outside of Bangor, Maine. Born in Florida, raised in Georgia. About 2 years ago, my wife and I, on a whim, decided to just pick up and leave everything we'd ever known and try Maine out and see how we like it. So we're up here with our 2 kids. Just seeing what life is like where we don't know anyone and where we've literally never been before. So that's kind of been the last couple years of my life, but you know me through my day job as an account manager. I've worked in digital marketing for about 12 years. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think you and I have a lot in common. In the brief conversations we've had so far in a work capacity, I feel like you and I are very kindred spirits.
I think so too, Zack. And just for the audience, I've known Zack now for probably 25 days in terms of a work situation. He came on as our account manager, and we've had a handful of conversations. And the reason we're talking now is that last conversation we had with our weekly check-in, I asked him what he did this weekend, and he asked me, and I said, well, I'm working on a project. And Zack said, so am I. I do a podcast. And I said, really? No way. I do a podcast too. So we started to talk about it. As you, for the audience, if you look up Grinding to a Halt by Zack Van Nuss, he's got over 30 plus episodes. They're fantastic. And this was going to be, a conversation where, we'll talk about some serious stuff, but talk about life stuff. And one question that I didn't know about, that I'm going to ask you about something that I didn't know, except for just now, that you and your wife moved to Bangor, Maine.
Yeah.
What was that conversation like between the two of you? Because I would imagine that you both have to be all in with that choice to make it work.
Yeah, the speed at which my wife and I live our lives is vastly different than how most people do. So, like I said, I'm 35. January, so a couple months from now, will be our 16th wedding anniversary. I was 19, she was 21,
Wow.
and we only knew each other 6 months before we got married. We
Hmm.
met and we were like, oh, this makes sense. Let's do this.
Mhm.
And that's just how we are. We're like, we'll figure out the details later and we'll make it work because we decided that this is the person I want to be with. So whatever else happens, hell or high water, we're going to make this work out.
Hmm.
And moving was pretty similar for us. We are the only people in our age bracket who the housing market has worked out for. So getting
Yeah.
married so young and
Right.
then starting to have kids young, we were in a very different mindset. So as my friends were graduating college, I was buying a house and having my first kid. So
Right.
we bought in 2011 and then we're in that house for 11 years. So we had a ton of equity. She stopped working when we had our second kid. And so the conversation was just kind of, all right, we've got a bunch of money we're just sitting on. I work remote. You don't have to worry about work.
Right.
What do you want to do? Where do you want to go? And her only stipulations were, I want land. We were in a neighborhood with like 500 houses in it. She's like, I don't want to see neighbors.
Hmm.
And I would love to have snow at Christmas. And those were really the only things that we talked about.
There are a lot of options, but they're all north of Pennsylvania.
Yes. Yeah. And so we had a house lined up in Vermont. And so like I flew up there. It was a brand new construction. We were 10 days out from closing. We were about to sell our house and it just fell apart. The deal,
Mm.
the house came back. There was a ton of stuff on the inspection that needed to be fixed. And we were like, all right, do we see this through and go through the hassle of a brand new house that already needs work? Or do we cut our losses and try something else? And we couldn't find anything else in Vermont that we liked.
Hmm.
And and so Maine, neither of us had ever been to Maine. And I was like, Stephen King lives in Bangor.
Right.
What
Totally.
What if
That
we
is-
go to Maine?
Which is hilarious. And I see all those Stephen King books on your bookshelf,
Yeah.
and clearly a fan. A question for you. You married your wife when you guys were just young adults.
Mhm.
Most kids are kids. A
Yeah.
lot of younger men, especially at age 19, are either drifting or they're trying to figure themselves out. But it sounds to me like you and your wife really operate as a team. Like
Mhm.
you guys found each other, you know each other, you probably maybe some people who might believe in past lives think you might have known each other.
Mhm.
Is that how you see your relationship?
We have each other's backs. Like it for us, it's that simple. I think that love is a choice. Every day I have to wake up and decide to be a good husband. I have to decide to be a good father. And I have to decide to pursue the things that show them that I love them. Those are actions. Love is a verb. It requires action. It requires me to put forth something. But even on the days when I'm a bad husband, which is often because I'm human,
Right.
she has my back still. She gives me the grace I need to screw up and to not be the person she needs me to be in a certain moment, and I extend her that same grace. And both of us come from vastly different but similarly troubled childhoods. And I think seeing those things within each other and knowing that someone has our back makes it really easy to get over the bad days when we know at the end of all of it, she's not going anywhere and I'm not going anywhere. And I feel
Sure.
like that's what a lot of people are looking for, is just that security. And I feel like that's really the thing that we found a good balance of.
That security is interesting. That's the word that I was thinking of when you were talking about it. And the other word that I was thinking of was a safety net,
Mhm.
where someone that always catches you emotionally, spiritually,
Mhm.
relationship wise, where as we all have bad days,
Yeah.
there's a certainty and I guess a comfort level knowing that you're with the person that you're with who is, I don't know, it is like your other half, right?
Mhm.
Is the person that is always on the other side of you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we're there for each other. And like
Right.
that's nice, because a lot of people don't have that, because it takes a full buy-in at all times. Like,
Sure. And I love the idea that love is a verb. One of my growing up, I watched it was Schoolhouse Rock, all those
Mhm.
cartoons. And
Yeah.
so they had conjunction, junction, what's your
Yep.
function? One of my favorite ones though was verb. And
Mhm.
Verb is an action. It was this superhero guy, and he
Yeah.
does all this stuff. And at the very end, it's to run, to drink, to love, and then the end to love.
Mm.
So if anyone hasn't watched it, just Google Schoolhouse on YouTube, Schoolhouse Rock Verb. That's what's happening. It's just awesome, And but the last word of Verb
Mhm.
is love. It's an
Yeah.
action word.
Yeah.
Right. And you can commit to that with so many things, either your work or your spouse or your children or your pursuits. But I love that. So you wake up thinking then how I love.
Mhm. Yeah. It's something that, and I know we'll get into this as we, expand into more of who I am and where I came from, but I didn't feel a lot of love growing up. So for me, it's not something that honestly comes naturally. I feel very guarded, and as open as I am as a person, and you've listened to my show, and even for me to like you as a client be like, oh yeah, check out my podcast, and like the shit I say on there is stuff that a lot of people would not want anyone they work with to hear.
Understood.
But then like love, I'm still very protective of love. Like for me,
Sure.
that is so closely guarded because it is so sacred to me, because it's something I've so scarcely felt growing up.
It is interesting. There's a preciousness that happens with things you don't have,
Mm-hmm.
and you take it more seriously.
Yeah.
Right. It sounds like you take love very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your, you mentioned that you had a challenging childhood. In your podcast, you mentioned that it was an evangelical Christian family.
Yes.
And on the surface, someone might say, well, that should have a lot of Christian love because that's a
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote family value. How do you reconcile that wasn't quite that loving household, yet under the auspices of what would be an evangelical Christian environment?
Yeah. So growing up in the South, being Christian is almost cultural as opposed to like an active choice you make.
Mm-hmm.
Like you just kind of, you grow up like, oh, I'm Southern Baptist. Obviously, I go to a Baptist church.
Right.
Why do I believe it? Because I was told I do. And then there was this added layer of, so I'm one of 7 kids, big family, which is also very, very normal in like fundamentalist Southern Christianity to, kind of quiverful movement, if you're familiar with that,
Mm-hmm.
of the go forth and be fruitful. My parents
Mm-hmm.
were very fruitful.
They went forth and were fruitful.
They were fruitful. So I'm the fifth of 7. So a little past the middle point in that line, and we were all homeschooled. And so like my world was very, very small. I grew up like we were at home, and then we were at church, and then we were at home, and we were at church. And that was the entire cycle. And because of the way we were raised at home, which was, I joke and say we were homeschooled. My parents just forgot the schooling part. And like, they just kind of kept us home. And so when you're a kid, you don't know that you're not normal, because all you know is what's happening to you. So to you,
Sure.
and especially when you have a lot of siblings, and you're like, oh, obviously this is what everyone's like. And then when I was at church and I would see kids my age, and we're talking, 8, 9, 10 years old, who could read. And at that point, I still was unable to read because no one taught me. I thought that something was wrong with me. And so I thought, oh, I'm either too dumb to know how to do this, I'm incapable, or I'm not worthy because no one's taking the time to teach me. So it's, no matter what it is, it's a problem that's me. I'm the issue here.
Yeah, that's really hard for an 8 and 9-year-old if you feel like you're not valued or you feel like you're not valuable.
Yeah.
In terms of seeing other words. When you saw that other kids were reading, how did you see it? Were they reading the Bible and looking at words, and you would just see pages and not understand it?
Pretty much. Yeah. So
wow.
It would, like, if it would be in a Sunday school class, and I went to what would be considered a mega church So each grade had its own individual classes, and in those classes, there'd be like 15 to 20 kids for each age
Mm-hmm.
group through elementary school. And so pretty large groups of kids, but all your same age range. And so it was really hard to hide because it wasn't like a smaller church. You might have like pre-K through like fifth and sixth graders, and you could kind of hide in the background. So the expectation going in, and rightfully so, was that all the 9-year-olds would know how to read because that's kind of just expected. So like you get called on, and there's like this moment of panic of how do I get out of this without being embarrassed, because I don't want anyone to know, because there was a lot of shame that came with it.
Sure.
Of being different or being, somehow less than. And so I tell everybody, like, that's how I became an account manager. That's how I got good at my job, was as a kid having to deflect from things that I was incapable of doing. Of how do I be funny, or how do I be convincing and get out of this thing? Because I can't do it. Everybody else can do it, but I can't let anyone know. And you're a kid. You think you get away with things. There had to have been people that knew and saw through it, but didn't want to say anything. So
or in a moment of grace, we're trying to be kind and not humiliate you.
Yeah. So I hope so.
Yeah. You would hope. So you taught yourself to read and write, which is astonishing. Mm-hmm. It got me thinking of a book called The Autobiography of Malcolm X, written by Malcolm X. And he taught himself to read and write by copying the dictionary in prison. Like that's how he did it.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking, and I'm not saying that you lived in a prison, but a prison is a very enclosed environment. Mm-hmm. How did you teach yourself to read?
Watching movies with subtitles on.
Wow.
And so like movies to me are deeply important. Like, I mean, you can see behind me, there's books above me and movies below me. Like, it is
interesting.
I collect all of those things because they're deeply, deeply important to me. But yeah, I would watch movies with the subtitles on and just try to follow along with what they were saying, which made learning to write very difficult because I didn't learn how words are built. Like, I learned what words look like, and then like had to reverse engineer
the structure of them.
Yeah. So it was really difficult.
That's remarkable, Zack, because in some way it gets me thinking about how you think. Mm-hmm. That you actually taught yourself how to reverse out the structure of a word to understand the grammar and the syntax, the roots of a word, maybe a Latin root of a word, how a noun is different than a verb or an adverb or an adjective. That actually, I think, created a lot of, I don't know, mental self-resilience, if that's a phrase at all, an ability for you to create and fix things just in your mind.
Yeah. No, I'm not one that leans into like every point of pain has a purpose, or that there's always a lesson to be learned out of loss. I think sometimes pain is just pain.
Yeah.
And sometimes loss is just loss. It doesn't have a greater meaning. But it's hard to divorce the person I am now and the way I think and the way I operate from that kid that learned to read by watching movies. Like, I feel like those things are so tied to the way my brain works and the person that I became because of that. I feel like if I had gone to school, if I had a traditional childhood, my career path would have been vastly different. Like, I never saw myself getting into what I do. I hated talking on the phone until I became an account manager in my early 20s. Like, I was terrified of talking on the phone, and now it's all I do. All I do is talk. And now in my free time, I talk. So,
well, and there's a comfort that you have with language. You're very well spoken, and clearly there's this transition that you made in your life to understand language and the power of language to articulate thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. No, and I think being in a big family, there's always a fight for attention. Every kid needs attention no matter what. I only have 2 kids, and it's still a struggle to give them the amount of attention they need. And I know you're a father too, and they crave it because they need it. You have to give children individual attention, and it has to be suited to who they are. I believe it was John, who was on your show, who's one of 7, I believe, also.
Yeah.
And like talking about the types of relationships he has with each of his siblings and the types of relationships the parents had to have with each one. And like,
Right.
I have such drastically different relationships with each of my kids. Like the way I talk to them, the way we communicate, the amount of shit they give me. Like,
but it shows you're paying attention.
Exactly. And as a kid, I didn't get that attention. There was a constant fight for that attention. And it wasn't just who was the loudest, because that didn't work in our house. It's funny you use like the prison metaphor. My dad was a cop, so maybe the prison metaphor is kind of apt. But like it was very quiet. Like everybody would comment like how well behaved the kids are, but it's because we knew we weren't going to get attention by being loud. And so I learned that if I was good at something, I could get attention. So I got really good at, even before I could read, memorizing Bible verses. So like,
because if you couldn't read it, you could memorize it.
So like my mom could read it to me and I could lock it in instantly. Like I've always had a really good memory. I'm 35. It's not as great as it was then, but like I could memorize.
But it's also compensatory. If you couldn't read it, you would want to memorize it.
Exactly. So I could memorize mountains of Bible verses, and our church did Awana. They did Bible quizzes, things like that. And I could go in and I could win every single Bible quiz without being able to read a single Bible verse, because I could just retain all the information. And so that got me positive attention I was looking for. By being good at something, it just all happened to be language based, but it was something I had to learn without being able to do it myself. So like it became part of this relationship with my mom, who I wasn't going to get the attention from elsewhere, with her reading me these passages and me memorizing them.
Yeah, I love that. I am not a learning scholar. I do not know about how the brain learns. I'm not a professional at all, but I have to conjecture that if you knew and were self-conscious of not being able to read, in order to make sure that you could feel like you fit in, which is a primal human need to fit into the social group that you're a part of, there's this almost survival instinct in you kicked in to remember every single thing that she was saying, so that you could not only be comfortable in a group, but also win her affection.
Yeah, it's deeply impressive to me now, looking back, as like the person that did it, but as a parent, like deeply heartbreaking.
Yeah,
at the same time.
Right at the same time, right? The gift that you were given, but like you said, it doesn't mean that there's not heartbreak with it. There was some. I remember growing up and going to school. One of the
just brag. Why don't you just rub it in? You got to go to school.
I know. I had feet. But we had to memorize poems as part of the lesson, and man, that was really helpful. And your ability to memorize, scripture. Because, I mean, let's face it, it's not easy language, and it's not really short. There's not known for brevity.
Also, we were Southern Baptists, so it was King James. It was all thous and these and thuses. So it was like an added layer of just difficulty on top of stuff I didn't comprehend. Because, like,
you didn't know what you were saying, but you knew the language. I think that's fascinating. And now, are you in good relations with your parents right now?
I have not spoken to my parents or any of my siblings in almost 4 years.
4 years? Okay.
We just had a full cut.
Yeah.
And it's not even on bad blood. Like, I think people, when you say I don't have any sort of contact, people assume there's like this hatred or this bitterness. And for me, as I was becoming the person that I am and growing into the person I wanted to be, there was this divergent path.
Sure.
And part of that was, I think, shocking to my parents, because I was the one who I think they thought was going to go into ministry. I was the most bought into Christianity. I loved it, lived it, breathed it, mission trips. I like volunteering, even at 17, 18 years old, I was volunteering like 40 hours a month, working in a special needs program at our church. Like
Wow.
stuff that no teenage boy is doing, like
Right.
voluntarily giving up their weekends. But to me, like, because I had at that point taught myself to read and read the Bible a lot, because if I'm bought into something, I want to know everything about it. That's also part
Mhm.
of how my brain works. So reading the Bible cover to cover, and I'm like, no, service is 90% of this. Like, if you read this book, what I'm supposed to do is love others, take care of the poor. Like, that's kind of it.
And serve, right.
so, so for me, it became very service driven. And then I had my son at 22, 23, and a lot of what I believed kind of broke down
Hmm.
because it shattered my world so much.
How so?
So I grew up very much with this idea of like God the Father. God is an all loving Father, and all he wants for you is the best. But that was also paired with what I was told of we're born broken and we're born sinful and we're born incomplete. And there's this hole
Mhm.
in you that only God can fill. And I believed it. I remember at 6 years old, like crying and saying the prayer because I didn't want to go to hell because I believed I was broken.
Born
I've
into
got
sin.
I've got the date tattooed on my wrist of the day I became a
Wow.
Christian, October 8th, 1995. So 29
Wow.
years ago, 2 weeks ago today. So like I believed it, and that was my worldview. And then I had my son, and I remember holding my son for the first time and looking down at him and being like, no, this is a perfect creature. Like,
Yeah.
he's not broken. He's not incomplete. There is
Right.
nothing wrong with him. And so this idea of God being the Father and we're all broken and he wants to save us, but the world is so broken, like it just didn't jive with me anymore. And then I
Mhm.
don't know if you're familiar with deconstruction, but
Mhm.
I kind of went through deconstruction for a couple of years of like, all right,
Sure.
let me pull away the pieces that don't make sense. People have been doing this
Right.
with the Bible for centuries. So now it's my turn. What
Right.
doesn't make sense to me? And the first thing to go is like, all right, hell goes. That's not real. I don't believe
Mhm.
that anymore. And then eventually it made sense for me to just be like, none of this works for me anymore. And that's
Yeah.
okay. Like it got me to a good place, but now I don't need it. And that was kind of a schism with my family because it was, I think,
Sure.
such a shock. Not that I was like, an angry atheist because I'm still agnostic. I don't have the answer, and I love not having the answer.
Uh-huh.
Um, but for them, it was too much to take, and it kind of broke the relationship.
For
And
now.
and
For
and
now.
if, yeah, and for me,
It-
nothing's a closed door.
exactly. And we don't know, one of the things that I was chatting with a friend of mine who's going through a very hard time. I said, out of through all of this, I'm not going to belittle or try to give you the rosy picture of the
Mm-hmm.
challenges you have, but whatever you're going through now won't always be forever.
Mm-hmm.
Things always will change.
Yeah.
But Zach, I really appreciate you mentioning that moment of spiritual or emotional clarity and seeing
Mm-hmm.
your young child where some people do believe that we were born into sin and there's only
Mm-hmm.
one path through salvation.
Yeah.
For me personally, when I looked at my children when they were born, I didn't see a sinful
Mm-hmm.
creature. I just saw the manifestation of the beauty of the universe and
Yeah.
whatever God is and how you see him or her or it.
Yeah.
Why isn't that living in my child? Of course
Yeah.
it's living in my child, right?
Yeah.
Um, so it's interesting. I stopped being a Christian a very long time ago. So my mom was Lutheran. My dad was not involved or interested in any of that,
Mm-hmm.
and his side of the family it wasn't a part of the life.
Yeah.
But my mom, at some point, especially after my folks got divorced, kind of leaned in a little bit, and so we would go and that was fine, and it didn't sink into me so deeply.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I did some more reading about the greater mythologies of the world and the
Yeah.
spiritual practices that historically created the mechanisms for Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's Adonis or Attis or Mithras, and the compassionate teachings of the Buddha in 500 BCE,
Yep.
and the perfect social construct for Christianity to flourish in Rome, where it was embraced by the poorest of the poor in a very violent society with violent gods, a perfect antidote to all of that.
Yeah.
And then with the advent of writing and taking that Roman tradition of writing through Christianity and spreading that into Europe, where the only ones who could read and write in Europe at the time were the Christians.
Yep.
Very easy to send orders and create a government and talk to people about what was there. So to me, when I look back at the historical flourishing of Christianity, it's I think I see it in a more historical context. And I thought on your podcast you had mentioned, so I thought it was a very beautiful metaphor where you talked about the Christianity shadow of the world, whether you want to fall into that shadow and feel cooled and protected, or whether you feel a little bit overshadowed in a negative way. It's your personal choice. But I think for you to come away or to have a true epiphany and a spiritual moment that happened with the birth of your child, I can't think about how poetic that is, because Christianity was all about the birth of a child.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. It's a poetic moment.
100%. And it's also not lost on me that I had the exact opposite experience of most people. Most people have a child and then they're like, oh, there is a God, there is more. And mine was the opposite. I was like, oh no, this is it. This is all that matters. Nothing else matters to me anymore.
Right.
But it didn't lessen the importance of a lot of the things I learned, or a lot of that foundation, even just down to the simplicity of, I've had the same best friend since I was in third grade. So we've known each other almost 30 years, and we met at Vacation Bible School at church.
Love it.
And I met my wife at church, like literally my first day at the church. I had grown up going to one. I turned 18. I had a lot of tattoos. My hair was really long at that time. Southern Baptists aren't big fans of that. And so I was like, oh, I'll go find a new church that fits me better. And literally within 5 minutes of being there, bumped into my wife. 6 months later, we were married. So like, I don't know my wife. My kids don't exist in the form they are now without that. Like it was an important season of my life. But for me, it was a season that for now is over. I don't know the future. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm over a year into writing and researching a podcast about religion.
Great.
And in that process, I am like finding so many beautiful stories, along with absolutely terrible stories because people are involved, but like so many beautiful stories that like remind you of why this is important and why these things flourish throughout the centuries the way they do.
And the solace and comfort it gives people, right? I mean,
exactly.
And in no way do I dismiss any of that. One of my dear friends is a pastor, and so we go on runs usually every week. And I mean, we talk about everything, but we talk about that, right? In fact, he officiated my daughter's wedding. We're that close, and it's an interesting thing that you meet people who kind of adjust and steer your life. It almost seems like there's a part of you at 18 that was looking for, I'm not going to say a way out, but kind of looking for a way out without even knowing it by moving churches, which is at that point a big transition, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then finding in a serendipitous moment the woman who be A, woman, B, kindred spirit, C, soulmate, D, new from past life, if you believe in that stuff, E, the partner I want to be with for the rest of my life, right? And you were open emotionally to be aware of that person.
Yeah. It is important, and similar to you, like I don't want to discourage anyone, or I don't want anyone to think, again, I think this goes back to like when you cut ties with someone, whether it be forever or for a season, people think that it's rooted in this anger or this bitterness. And I have no anger or bitterness towards faith as a whole. I think faith is beautiful. I think organized religion can be deeply troubling and downright evil at times.
But for me,
like, I was definitely one of those people in the early 2000s. It was like, no, I don't have religion. I have a relationship. Like the faith part was what was beautiful to me because faith requires me to release control. Like
Mm-hmm.
all, and I have a lot of family members and friends now who would consider themselves Christian nationalists. So it is about domination. It's about control. They have
Mm.
the answer and they will impose their will. And to me, no, you don't have Christianity at all if that's what you have,
Right.
because Christianity is releasing of self. You have no control. Christ is in control and you have faith that he will take care of you. So if you're telling people you have the answer, you don't have faith. You can't have the answer
Right.
and faith at the same time. I find
Yeah.
faith deeply beautiful, all types of faith, because
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
faith
that's what.
is death of ego.
Right. Well, and it's interesting. People, this one, um, I was talking to a colleague about it years and years ago, and she says, well, like she said something about, oh, well, you don't believe or anything. I was like, that's not true, right?
Mhm.
My faith journey is absolutely my own. And so,
Yeah.
to your point about organized religion, I think what's interesting is you have, religion, which is huge, and then you have church, which is more local, and then
Mhm.
you have faith, which is private and
Yep.
personal, right? And there, for some people, there's an alignment of religion and church and faith.
Yeah.
For some, there isn't, right? And I think that when I think about as you practice your daily faith, however that plays out, and you're doing the research now, just kind of a history of religion, and there's so much stuff out there. Um, what what gives you like these feelings of faith? And the reason I ask is like there are moments when I'm with a person, like maybe like yourself or with my family, where there's this deep connection that I'm like, I really see you.
Mhm.
There are moments when I'm in nature in particular where I kind of feel the presence,
Yeah.
right? Um, are there moments now where you feel a kind of faith, even if you can't describe it in specific religious terms?
Yeah. And as weird as it sounds, it could be watching like a really good horror movie. I am like deeply into
Oh, wow.
all things horror. I don't know if you're familiar with the show Midnight Mass.
I'm not.
So it is Mike Flanagan. He's essentially what if Stephen King just wrote and directed movies. He's done a couple Stephen King adaptations.
Okay.
And for me, what he nails about Stephen King and the thing that Stephen King has resonated for 50 years as an author at this point is that the root of all of his stories is empathy. He deeply cares
Right.
about people. It
Right.
is about how evil can come in and corrupt good people and how good people can stand up to that evil and defeat it. And it's about the empathy of those characters and really understanding who they are.
We'll be right back.
And
I like that. I want to pause and hold
yeah,
on to that thought a moment. I really like that idea. I remember reading one thing about him where he says, if I can't, terrify him, I'll horrify him. If I can't
mhm,
horrify him, I'll scare him. If I can't scare him, I'm going to gross him out.
yeah,
But what I always found about reading his books was you're right. It's the people that are at the center of it,
mhm,
right? Whether it's The Stand or The Shining, and these people are characters that I still remember and think about
exactly.
years after I've read the book.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a kind of magic, but it comes from him deeply caring about people. He's a deeply empathetic person. And that's why he writes kids so well. Like something
Mm-hmm.
like It, or even in like Dreamcatcher, where he talks about these kids that are bullied because he was mercilessly bullied as a kid. Like he
Yeah.
remembers what that's like. And so he can write it in a way that is impactful and meaningful. And that, like I said, for 50 years, he's written nothing but bestsellers because people are just latch on to it.
Right.
But Midnight Mass is a show about faith. It is about a small island community, very in the Northeast, very Stephen King. And these miracles, in quotes, start happening around this small church when a new pastor comes in or when a new priest comes in. And it's about like these lines of division that get drawn in a small community among people of faith as miracles start to happen. But are these
Hmm.
miracles good miracles, or are they curses? What is actually happening here? And there's a moment in the show, and I apologize because it's going to get heavy, but there's a moment in the show where there's a character that has a miscarriage.
Hmm.
And a couple years previous to this show, my wife and I had a miscarriage, and I
Ah.
hadn't known how to process that yet. I
Hmm.
was, and from my perspective as the guy, like, I'm powerless in the moment that it's happening. There's nothing I can
Yeah.
do, but physically it's not actually happening to me. So the way I have to process it has to be thinking about my wife first and kind of backburnering what I'm feeling, because she's feeling it 1,000 times more than I am. It's her body. And so I did what most of us do as guys, like I think we are trained to do, which is after it's over, I didn't process it immediately. So I just kind of buried it. And I tried not to think about it. But those things fester. You never get over something like that. But there's a scene in the show after one character has a miscarriage, and the two leads are sitting on a couch asking, "What do you think happens when we die?" And the woman who just had a miscarriage gives a lengthy monologue about her perspective, the perspective of the baby that just died. Of, no, this baby was never awake. She was born as came into existence asleep. She floated down from heaven, was here for a short time. So life for her was a nap. And then she goes back to heaven. So all she knows is the people that love her family that are in heaven waiting for her. And then one day she's going to go to heaven and she will see her child too. So it's just a perfect being that never knew pain, a perfect existence, and life on earth was just a nap. It was just a dream. And there was something about that monologue that just
Hmm.
like, I just started weeping while I was watching the show. And like, I was like, no, like, this makes sense to me. And I don't even believe in heaven. I don't believe in any of that, but the framing of it, of
Yeah.
it clicked and made sense in a way that I don't think I could have had it made sense on my own. And so getting back to your question of like, where do I find faith? It's in moments like that of
Right.
finding connection, whether it be in a conversation like this, like, if I believed in a God where two or more are gathered, God is here with us, whatever God is to us
Sure.
individually. But watching that show on my iPad, sitting in bed, crying like a baby, that was faith for me too. And then I'm
Hmm.
also a death metal guy. So being in a circle pit at a death metal show is also faith to me. Like it's communal. We're all there together. It's so primal and we're all beating our
It's
chest and being one. I love that
right.
stuff.
You know what? I think that, you hit on this idea of primal and being one,
Hmm.
where the Buddhist concept of energy is that it's all energy, right? It's
Yep.
all wave, and so there's a path towards connecting to that energy. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, George Lucas transformed it into the Force, right? You're connecting to the larger
Yep.
larger stuff. Um, there's an extraordinary man that I met. His name is David Patrick, and we're figuring out how he can be on this show too, so he can talk about what he's discovered. But he's discovered these patterns within living organisms and in any pattern. So, and the pattern really is one where it comes up and around. It's an upward spiral, and once you see the pattern, you see it everywhere. You see it in a
Hmm.
tree. You see it in the navel to our nipples. You see it in the dog's nose. You see it when you
Yeah.
cut a tomato open. A bell pepper. It's like it's everywhere. It's the same pattern. And so the question that I have to then ask myself is when I see that is that there's a connection. There's a deep
Hmm.
connection between all these various creatures. And we know that, there's been enough written, enough experiential anecdotes where we connect with a horse or we connect with a dog or a cat
Hmm.
or a person, right? There's some kind of connection. Or
Yeah.
people talk about vortexes and they connect to a place. So I love your idea of faith and that it's primal and it's connecting with the one.
Hmm.
And I think of all the permutations and manifestations that could be.
Yeah. It's endless because that is every organized religion boils down to that. of we're all connecting to what is greater than us. And for me, the thing that is greater than me is the rest of humanity.
Right.
Like, that's what I feel like at the end of the day, we're all actually striving to connect with. We all don't want to feel alone because no matter what happens next, we don't have the answer. All we have is right now. And for me, the beauty is in the finite. If everything goes on forever, I find it less valuable. I find beauty
Talk
in
about that preciousness again.
Exactly. Yeah. Not to be too marketing brained, but the scarcity. I like the scarcity. It drives the demand. That's what drives my demand for life. It's why I'm up at 10:30 at night when I'm going to wake up at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning and go to the gym. Like, I'm.
yeah. The scarcity of sleep. I remember it well. But I like that concept, Zach, when you talk about preciousness
Mhm.
and value.
Yeah.
Right? The things that are value are precious. The things that are precious are scarce.
Yep.
Right? When you have love, you know how precious it is. You know how valuable it is because you also know for many people or in parts of your life, there can be a scarcity of love. And that's a real challenge for folks. Do you consciously and intently think of these thoughts throughout the day, or are there moments when you're reading something or we're talking when they kind of flash in?
This is pretty much the mode my brain is in at most times. This
Wow.
is kind of how I think. I'm very present. I don't daydream. I don't think about the past. Like, I am very in the moment, which frustrates my wife beyond all belief. Because she could not be more opposite. Everything is,
Of
she's
course,
thinking
yin
about
and
the future
yang.
or she's thinking about the past, but
Right.
I'm here because this is all I have. And so when I'm here and I'm present, I'm thinking about these things because I'm thinking about how do I derive as much meaning out of this moment because I might not have another one.
Hmm. It's interesting. You said being in this moment and you might not have another. And I did note in your conversation starter that
Mm-hmm.
you almost took yourself to the edge where you wouldn't have another.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll do the right proper stuff in the beginning. So I read a book called How to Know a Person by David Brooks. He's written a ton of stuff. The Second Mountain, The Social Animal. He's a reporter, quote unquote reporter, but he's a columnist for the New York Times and he's on PBS NewsHour. And beyond the political stuff he writes about people and sociology and the like. But his book, How to Know a Person, he recounts in detail losing a dear friend of his to suicide. And he thought about how he could have talked to him differently, how he could have had better conversations with him. And I guess a question I have for you, when you walk back from the edge, did you earn some wisdom in that moment that you can pass on to someone else who might be in a similar situation?
Yeah, I learned how to talk about what I was feeling in ways that I didn't feel like I could before. And I think part of it is when you're, all of this in scare quotes, a husband and a provider, like we take on so many of these things and we feel like, no, I have to tough it out and I have to push through. And I remember the exact moment and it wasn't like that I planned. It was the moment that it made sense that I was going to do it. And that's something that in talking with other people who have either attempted to take their own life or plan to take their own life, there's like this moment of clarity, which is the scariest part of like, oh no, this is the answer. This makes perfect sense. Like, it's not like this fantasy anymore. It's like, oh, this is what needs to be done. I understand now. And like, I remember that happening. I was on back-to-back calls all day long. And this, you're in a weird position because like you see me on work calls and I am all energy at work. Like I tell everybody there's work Zack and there's real Zack. And it's not that I'm being disingenuous, but it is very performative for me to do my job because I feel like I have to be on. I have to be, I'm selling all the time, whether or not I'm trying to get you to buy something or not.
You have to be work Zack.
Exactly.
That's your role in that. But also, too, you just told me earlier, just now, that you're very intentional about being present and in the
Hmm.
moment.
Yep.
And when you're at work, Zach, you are work, Zach, because you're
Hmm.
in the moment in that
Exactly.
role.
Yeah, because I do care, and
Yeah.
I hope that comes through. That I take it very seriously when other people are trusting me with their business.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that is not something to take for granted. Every single call is an opportunity for me to either improve someone's life or fuck their business up really badly. And so,
Let's do the former. Let's improve.
exactly. So the intentionality is important. But I was on back-to-back calls, all energy, and I remember getting off the last call and just like collapsing on the floor. I like could not take anymore. And I did not know how to talk to my wife about it without, because in my mind, if I have that conversation, that's me saying, hey, I know you're taking care of our kids, both of whom are autistic, by the way. So there's an added layer of difficulty of taking care of special needs children.
Mm-hmm.
But hey, I'm going to need you to do that and make money too, because I don't know if I can keep working. Like, I didn't even know how to approach that conversation. I didn't know how to talk about,
Sure.
hey,
That's a scary conversation.
Absolutely. But I don't know how to talk about, and she knew I dealt with depression, but like how to have the conversation of, hey, it's worse than it's ever been. I didn't know how to approach that. So she was at her dad's house with the kids. They were out swimming. It was summer. And I wrote my notes and I left the house. And like, and it wasn't just planning. It was, oh no, this is going to happen. Like it was, now is the time. So she knew something was off. So she started calling me nonstop. And then obviously when I didn't pick up, she really knew something was wrong. And so after furious texting and calling and calling and calling, I answered. And she was like, well, just come home and we'll talk about it. And so I came home, and by then she had already come back without the kids. She left them with the in-laws, and she had found the notes that I had left, and I had written one for her and then one for each of the kids. And then we just talked about it. And it was, all right, now how do we moving forward check in regularly? So that became the safeguard of, I have to take the responsibility of, she can't know what I'm feeling. And on top of it, I'm really good at masking because I'm performative by nature. So how do I check in a way that lets her know when things are good? Even to this point now, like to this day, years later, of if I'm leaving the house, just as a courtesy, just texting her like, hey, just so you know, I'm leaving. So like, I don't ever just disappear. Because
that's very thoughtful of you. I'm
not always good at it too. I also screw it up constantly.
But you try, and the intention is there to check in. I love that, Zach. I also think there's a sixth sense that your wife had, where she was texting and calling, and you knew from her outreach, a furious, repetitive, desperate outreach to you, that she was giving you that line to hold on to. Yeah. And then as soon as you called her back, she could pull you back in. But, congratulations on her for sensing what was happening and doing that action. Yeah. It's you know what? It gets back to the very first verb you talked about. It's the action of love.
100%. Yeah. No, like I tell people, and I have a very dark sense of humor anyway. So like I always tell people,
you read horror stories and watch horror movies.
But also like if I'm not joking about my mental health, you need to check in on me. Like that's how you know it's bad, if it's no longer funny to me and if I can't make a joke. So like I joke, I'm like, no, it's a joke, but it's not. I'm only alive because of her. Like at this moment, I would not be here.
Sure.
If she hadn't called.
Right.
So, and I know it's not easy for her. It's not, that goes back to that having each other's backs no matter what. It's difficult to be with a person who has severe mental health issues from time to time. I know it is. Yeah. It's hard enough to be in my own body sometimes. So I can't imagine being the person that has to deal with me.
It's my dad suffered from depression. He was a psychiatrist. So what I found interesting now, looking back later in life, is as he went through medical school and all that stuff, and instead of fixing knees or elbows, he decided to think about people's minds.
Yeah.
And I think he did that because he was also trying to understand his own mind. He was trying to understand, why the black dog was kind of around him. Like,
Yeah.
why are you here? What does that mean? And I kind of saw that through him. He had actually told me a story about him kind of describing how he might take his own life as well, what
Mhm.
medicines to use, how he could do it and be in a painless way so he could fall asleep easily. And he had all the drugs to do it, right? He
Yeah.
had everything he needed to do that. Um, but he figured out that he had to kind of do a one day at a time type of approach. But your transparency about talking about this makes it seem to me like this is something you're aware of and intentionally thinking about throughout the day, and you're letting
Mhm.
other people know what's happening so that they can also check in with you.
Yeah, I also feel a moral responsibility to talk about it.
Hmm.
Like, because I am so open, and part of it is because I genuinely don't care what anyone thinks about me. Like,
That's
I
beautiful. That's
obviously
liberating.
it is. Like, I want people to like me and I want people to get along with me, but I also don't care that much because at the end of the day I come home. I mean, I'm home all the time. I work from home. My wife and kids like me.
Yeah.
If people I bump into don't, or if I rub someone the wrong way, or if they think I'm too forward in the things that I say, I'm not out to hurt anyone's feelings. So I always know that my intentions are good. So if it just doesn't connect with them, that's not my problem. It's also not
Mm.
their problem. We just don't have to talk anymore. That's cool too. So like I do feel completely free from the weight that I know a lot of people carry, which is the need for approval. I don't feel that. And maybe it's because I just never got it. And so I learned to just be like, I approve of myself. We're good here. But
Right. That is interesting, right? That you didn't feel like you had it when you were young, so you might not need something that you
mhm,
never had.
mhm.
Some people do it the opposite way, right?
most most
They
people.
crave that approval if they don't
Hmm.
get it earlier.
Yeah.
But that is a very liberating way to live
Yeah.
where you can be your most authentic self, if not all the time, most all the
Hmm.
time.
Yeah. And so that's why like it's important for me to talk about it because I don't feel this weight of will someone look at me differently if I talk about my mental health. And I know a lot of people feel that. There is a possibility that career wise it could be harmful to me. I have the best SEO anyone could ever have on a name. I'm the only person alive with my name. So if a client Googles me, they're finding my podcast. If they happen
Sure.
to listen to it, they're learning a lot about me.
Yeah.
And it could rub people the wrong way. And like I said, that's never my intention and I don't want it to. But I just feel this need to talk about these things because if one person could hear it and it be impactful to them, or it could make them think, oh, I should probably raise my hand. And any of
Mm.
my podcast episodes where I've talked about mental health, I tell people like, well, first off, in the show notes, I'll always link out to free resources. And then I'll
Hmm.
tell people like, hey, if you feel like you're at risk, reach out to me. Personally, I might not be able to help you because my bandwidth could also be, I might not be in a good mental space, but I'll find you somebody who can help you.
Sure.
Like if it's that simple as just someone feeling seen or heard,
Hmm.
because I never really felt seen or heard because I didn't know how to talk about it. So if I can talk about it and help anybody, I feel like I morally I have to. I feel like
Yeah,
I have no choice.
I love that. I love that. It is interesting. There's time one of the colleagues that I work with works in what we in the church market space. So we do a lot of
Hmm.
direct marketing, and he talks about the Great Commission, right? And
Yep.
he talks about it in an evangelical way. What I actually think is interesting about the parallel is that you grew up in an evangelical household where
Hmm.
you were supposed to talk about being saved,
Yeah.
and you wind the clock now. You're in an evangelical mode or an evangelist for mental health,
Hmm.
right? Talking about mental health,
Yeah.
sharing with other people what you've learned and hope that they can also learn. It's a really interesting way in which you can manifest your upbringing in an evangelical household, but you're doing it for mental health and other people's true well-being.
Yeah. Yeah.
What an interesting parallel.
Like, I think this also goes back to what we said in the beginning. Like, I don't think all loss has a lesson or all pain has a purpose. But I do think that the things we learn and the things that we focus on, no matter what, will be recurring in our lives. Like there will be through lines of something we start. We'll finish somewhere. It might be 30 years down the road, but it will come back up. Like I said, I went on a lot of mission trips. I was a 14-year-old kid walking up to people in Miami trying to convert them to Christianity, just cold. Like
at 14? That's awesome.
The balls that takes to do that.
Right?
Like, but like I said, I was convinced that I had the truth. If I didn't help this person, they might go to hell. And now I kind of take that into the things I talk about on my show, whether it be mental health or it be as simple as, hey, you have to, if all you're doing is working, if your whole life is how much money you make or what car you drive, you've wasted your life. Like you have to be more, because what you do for a living is important, but it should be the least important part of your life.
Right.
Like it should allow me to be a better husband, a better father, because I can provide. But at the end of the day, I should be able to close my laptop and not have to think about it. I should be able to be present.
Yeah, I love that perspective. And it's an interesting one. There are some people for whom work and life are inextricably woven together. So even on this show, Lars Hegelson, who's a CEO of and founder of his own company, he's woven the company into his life, but not in a negative way, but because he wants to create a family. And the business has become his family. And it's he has a very caretaking perspective of the family that he's built with the company. And there are some other people that I've known where they are always working in a sense, right? Either through promotion or the like. But, you've got to have an interesting, division where, there's a work, Zack, and you're in the moment because you have to be that role to support the clients and the business you're in and your family. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the whole Zack.
Yeah. Like I said, it's not that it's a false version of me. It is a heightened version of me. It's a version of me I don't even know if I like all the time. But it's a version of me that takes care of the sides of me that I do like. It allows me to do the things that I want to do. It allows me to... Last year, I went to LA and I was an extra in music videos for a friend's album.
Awesome.
Like, just a random thing to be like, yeah, this would be fun. Life's too short not to do this.
Right.
And if I was still 19-year-old Zack pulling orders in a warehouse, you can't afford to just drop everything and fly to LA. But Zack, who's really good at his job and on top of his shit, yeah, he can afford to do that.
Yeah. And also too, Zack, who's really good at his job and on top of his shit, is very much the same Zack. That's a Zack holding his child. That's a Zack watching the movies. I don't think necessarily that we're as such different people. It's just a manifestation of the same person in a different environment. The sense of being present and being aware and being careful with other people. In a professional environment, it just means being careful of that professional relationship, but it's still being careful. Right? In some ways, I would argue it's still that verb of love. It's just a different kind.
It is. No, because like I said, I genuinely do care and I genuinely want the best for my clients. Like, it's important that when I get on a call with you or with any client, not just feel, you have my full attention. That I am present.
Yeah. And I think that's, though, honestly, Zack, just in the hour that we've spent, that's how you are with people.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to being that little kid that knew he wasn't getting the attention he needed and knew what that felt like and knew I was desperate. I was starving for that attention. And I know that everyone is. And as as everything becomes more digital and as we are in person with people less and less, even if it's through this screen, like someone just knowing you're looking at them and hearing them and
Mm-hmm.
engaging and not just waiting for your turn to talk, which is what so many of our day-to-day interactions are.
Right.
Like I find those things really meaningful, because if someone can leave a conversation with me, even if it's a work conversation and everything's bad, if nothing's working, if the marketing is in the toilet, but you know that I'm listening to you and I'm acknowledging what you're feeling, like that's still a good conversation. You're still going to
Sure.
have a positive interaction with me, even if the outcome of what we've been doing is negative.
but it's what, I think that the adage, it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because
Because it's
it's
true.
true, where it's not, people remember how they feel, not necessarily what you say. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that you come across to me, and just so the listeners know, this is actually the first real conversation that
Yeah.
we've had. But I feel not only listened to and heard, but I think you have a real understanding of how to connect with other people
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's at a human level.
Yeah.
And that is rare and precious and very valuable.
It's, I do tell people, like, whether it be in an interview or when you're getting to know, especially like new coworkers, and people ask like, what are you best at? Or like, what's your greatest skill? And I firmly believe my greatest skill is just getting people to trust me quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because we hop on this call and immediately, like I lock in, and this all came because I asked you about your weekend, and it wasn't just like surface, what did you do this
Right.
weekend? But like, no, I want to actually know. I want to have a
Yeah.
conversation. It's not that the work stuff's not important, but for me, what helps drive my passion for helping people succeed in their business is knowing what they're doing it for. Of what's the why behind you
Mm-hmm.
do this? Like, you have to have, everybody's got to pay their mortgage, but like, why this? Why is this
Right.
important to you? And if I can find out, oh, Chris does a lot of creative stuff in the background, like I do that. I know that is time consuming and expensive. So,
Well, and also too, I think what that does is that gives you, a deep and greater connection to
Mhm.
folks, and in some ways, without layering on a religious connotation, Zach, to me, the impression I get, it's a very spiritual life,
Mhm.
right? Where the best spiritual mentors I've ever met have been very present and in the moment, because they can then caretake of other people
Yeah.
in those moments. I love
Yeah.
it.
No, I do find myself to be very zen most of the time. I do feel like I have little to zero ego about most anything I do. I'm
Hmm.
proud as shit of my kids. Like, I
Yeah.
will fight anyone over that, but every good parent would.
Yeah.
But outside of that, like, I know I'm wrong most of the time. I know I don't know a lot,
Hmm.
which is important. And I know that I can always be better, but I can't control how people react to the things I do or the things I say. I can only take care of me. And if I genuinely offend or hurt someone, I know it's my job to take care of that. It's my job to rectify that. So
Mm-hmm.
just like trying to be present and trying to be the most whole person I can be is really all I care about. To me, that's, I don't know when this ends. So,
That words to live by, Zach. Words to live by. So I've got a last question for you,
yeah.
before we wrap up. Who is someone that you know that I don't know that I should know?
I've got two for you.
Excellent.
Um, one is my friend Kave Hoda, who's
Okay.
he's a doctor, he's a GI, and he hosts the show House of Pod. He is
Oh.
incredibly funny. He's so insightful. He is so kind. He was the guest on the first episode of my show before I even had anything out. I kind of knew him on Twitter, and I
Okay.
DM'd him. I was like, "Hey, you want to come on my podcast that doesn't actually exist yet?" And he was like, "Yeah, of course,
That's awesome.
happily." He's one, and then Clay McLeod Chapman is an author. He's been on my show as well. He is the most present and fun person I've ever had a conversation with. He is
Okay.
like, and this is out of the blue. I DM this guy who his books are behind me. And I was like, hey, I'm a fan. Any chance you got 30 minutes to talk to me? And he's like, yeah, I've got an hour. And like
Awesome.
immediately locked in and asking me deep personal questions, like super focused. Amazing guy. Writes the saddest books you will ever read. like
Awesome. You know, it's so funny when I should say it's funny talking about the saddest books. I read my wife and I are fans of Chapel Roan. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
But anyway, she had a meteoric rise, but they were interviewing her and she said, yeah, I could write sad songs, but then it'd be sad all the time. That's why I write these happy songs, because they're kind of pop and fun. So the fact that Clay McLeod Chapman writes the saddest books, that's awesome. He owns it.
I have a theory behind that. I think that the repeated confrontation of things that scare us make us stronger and make us happier. That is why, going back to horror, I have this story that I tell about being a little kid. One of my first memories is watching E.T. and being terrified of E.T. running through the forest, his chest glowing.
Right.
It scared the shit out of me as a kid. But I would rewind the tape over and over again, and I would watch it, and then it would scare me. And then I'd watch it again. And I watched it until it stopped scaring me, because then I could enjoy the rest of the movie. So I got through the scary thing, and then I could enjoy the whole of the picture.
See, even at that moment, Zach, there's a hard wiring about you that's so intentional.
Yeah, right? I was a weird kid. We could
I would even call it weird. I would call it a you kid. You're going to say, okay, I'll learn how to read. I'm scared of this moment, but I'm going to go through this process until I'm not scared anymore, and then I can fully enjoy the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. And Zach, I love you. I am so grateful to have had this conversation with you. And I'm so glad that our paths crossed in strange, wayward ways. The only unfortunate thing is that you literally live across the country in the farthest northeast, while I am literally in the farthest southwest of the United States. But hopefully we'll be able to see each other face to face one of these days.
One day we will make it happen. Without a doubt. It will be fun.
That to be true.
All right. We would have the best dinner together. We would be there for 5 hours.
That's what I'm talking about.
Also, I don't even drink, so you've got a DD. We're good
5 hours. I love it. I love it. Well, listen, you have a great evening. Thanks for staying up late. My blessings to you and your family, and maybe we can do this again.
Absolutely. I'll have you on my show next time.
I'd love it. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Chris.
Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo. Zack Van Nuss. Man, what a conversation. What a man. What a man. Teaching himself how to read. You know, thinking about this is the idea that faith is a moment and love is a verb. Love is an action verb. You do something with that love. Not only do you feel it, but you give it. You actively love other people. Maybe at times love yourself. It's not always easy, especially if you've got some dark weathers and clouds that kind of hang around you. You got to figure out how to get through that, see the sunlight, help other people help you see the sunlight. So what do we learn from Zack? That you can, in your own mind, learn how to learn who you are, and figure out the path to your most authentic self, even if that's not necessarily how you were or what you were born into. I think he is a remarkably inquisitive man, thoughtful, intentional, and in the moment. And why isn't that a life of faith? Be in the moment, present with people, connecting with people. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I hope you enjoy this podcast. If you do, please tell other people about it and subscribe. right? The more we can get listeners, the more we can grow this thing, and the more we can keep it going so we can learn from men just like you. And I invite you to book a conversation. Go to menfolkjourneys.com, book a conversation. I'd love to have a yik yak so we can learn from your story and get better because of it. Because isn't that the point of it all? That we all get better together? Yeah, I think so. Thank you for listening. Word bid Falarid.